Willkommen zurück. Wir kommen zu unserem nächsten Programmpunkt, nämlich Praxisbeispiele für Gedenkarbeit in Israel. Gleich wird uns Yaniv Sagi Einblicke verschaffen in die praktische Gedenkarbeit von Givat Raviva im Kontext von Versöhnung und ziviler Konfliktlösung. Herr Sagi ist Chief Executive Officer von Givat Raviva, eine israelische Bildung- und Dialoginstitution, die sich für die jüdisch-arabische Verständigung, für die Integration der arabischen Minderheit in den jüdischen Staat Israel und für Friedensforschung im Nahen Osten einsetzt. Guten Tag, Herr Sagi.
Good morning, Mr. Sagi.
Good morning.
Sie haben das Wort, bitteschön.
Please go ahead.
Okay, good morning, everybody. A bit weird to look at myself at the screen and not see those who are hearing me right now, but I'm thankful for the opportunity to continue our long-standing partnership with Rheinland-Pfalz in the good work that we do for the shared values that we share. I would like to give you a story, mostly a personal story, but also a story of a movement that brought Givat Raviva to action. And from that story, I will take you to the work that we do today. And the personal story starts in 1937, where I am not 83 years old, but my story starts in 1937, which is the year that my father was born in Bucharest, Romania, and at the same year my kibbutz Ein HaShofet, had started in Palestine, back then Israel to be later on. So my father was born in 1937, but at the age of 3 years old, his family already ran away from Bucharest. Big mistake, by the way, on their behalf. And they ran to a place where most of the Jewish population of Romania ended up during the Holocaust, which was Transnistria, where probably around 300,000 people had died. His young age, for almost 5 years, was growing up in concentration camps of Transnistria, where he lost his father. He came out of the Holocaust only with his mother and his sister, and that's his childhood. He was a refugee without his father, an orphan from his father, looking for a home in the world and carrying the memory of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. It was only in 1948 where he was able to arrive finally, after the beginning of the State of Israel, to Israel. Coming back to 1937, my kibbutz was the first kibbutz in the region of Menashe, in an area where there were 12 Palestinian villages. So it was not an empty place. There were Palestinians living there, and the Jewish people started coming, looking for a place to live in Israel. And pioneers from a youth movement, actually the first Zionist youth movement, which is called the Shomer HaTzair, came to live in this region. Those pioneers came from Poland and from the United States, and they tried to become good neighbors to those 12 Palestinian villages in the area. Between 1937 to 1948, they developed partnership. But when the war started, and in 1948, when it went to our region, we ended up in a situation where all 12 Palestinian villages just ran away or were pushed away, although the founders of my kibbutz had asked them to stay. And that was in May of 1948. Only 3 months later, my father, the refugee from the Holocaust, the orphan from his father, found a way to start his new life in my kibbutz, in Kibbutz Ein HaShofet, where only then he restarted being a human being with liberty and freedom to grow up as a human being. When I grew up in this kibbutz, he did not want to tell me about the stories of the Holocaust. He did not want me to know everything that he went through. But what he did want is to take me to the ruined village of Kafren, which is the nearest village to my kibbutz. And over there, in that village, he gave me the most important lesson of my life. He told me, you know that I'm a Holocaust survivor, and I'm standing here on the ruins of this Arab village where people used to live here before the war. And I want to tell you a lesson for life. One cannot solve a problem of people by causing a new problem to other people. There's no way to solve one problem with another problem. And therefore, the Jewish people will always have a problem until we finish the war between the Palestinian people and the Jewish people. And therefore, as a Holocaust survivor, this is my message. The way to deal with the memories of the past is by creating a better future. And the way to create a better future is by making sure that we don't do any wrongdoing and any harm to the liberty and freedom from people, no matter their race, their gender, their nationality. And basically, this had become my life mission. 1 year later, in the year of 1949, the movement of those kibbutzim, which is the same youth movement of HaShomer HaTzair, decided to create a national center, which is called Givat Chaviva. That center is working for the three pillar values of this movement, which is Zionism, and Zionism meaning the need to make sure that the Jewish people and the Jewish peoplehood have a way to continue, that they have a national home, that all Jews will be safe and that Jewishness will continue for ages. The second value was socialism. The kibbutzim came from a socialist approach where all people are equal, and therefore all people should have equal access to budgets, to land, to power. And the third was what is called in our movement language, brotherhood of people, which means living in Israel in a society that is based on equality and peace between Jews and Arabs in this country, and between Israelis and Arabs, Palestinians, and Arab nations all over the Middle East. This is the purpose and the goal of Givat Chaviva. Now, we are more than 70 years later, still in a war, in a conflict. We are still in a situation where the Arab citizens of the State of Israel are second-class citizens. They are not treated equally. There are actually even racist laws, like the national state law, which passed 2 years ago, that are against the Arabs, Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel. And Givat Chaviva is operating towards the creation of a shared society, which is based on equality. And what do we do with the memory? This is what we're here all about. What do we do in a country where the Jewish people are coming with the memories of the Holocaust? Most of them are not taking the memory in the same way that my father took it. They're taking it from the position of a suffering nation that needs to secure its safety. What do we do when the 20% Arab society living in Israel are in a situation where there is a law in Israel, which is called the law of the Nakba, where they are not allowed to teach and to commemorate their history, their suffering, their victimhood of the Nakba. There is a law against any kind of commemoration of the Nakba in Israel. How do we do it? How can we bring people together? Can we put the narratives aside? Can we forget about the memories? Can we not act upon the national narratives of the people living in Israel? And the answer of Givat Chaviva is, whether there is a law or there isn't a law, there is no way to connect between people if we do not connect to the memories, to the national memories of those who are living in Israel. And therefore, we connect by coming back to the national narratives of both people that are here. We bring people together. We bring them into a dialogue. We bring them into the same room. We bring them together even during the period or the era of COVID-19 through virtual settings, just like the one that we're having here. And the narratives are part of the discussion. We do not put any side aside saying that their narratives are not allowed in this country. All narratives are in essence for reconciliation. There will never be reconciliation by shutting down a narrative and memory of people in this country. So we are actually almost disobeying a law by permitting ourselves to deal with the Nakba. We call the Nakba by name. We make space and room for the story of the Nakba, and we make space of room for the story of the Holocaust and what brought the state of Israel to become, not only the Holocaust. And that is actually not such a bad place for reconciliation. This is a good place. As long as we're able not to stay in the victim position, that we're able not to put the other as a threat, but hear, understand, listen, contain the story of the other, and make it a base for a new dialogue for the future. And that's a very pivotal point about what's needed for a shared society in Israel. Our mission is not about the past, it's about the future. We are not a research center. We do not deal with the past just for the sake of understanding and remembering the past. We take the past in order to create a better future. This is our mission. And the mission is to create Israel as a shared society where we have shared responsibility for a shared future for the 100% of the citizens of Israel. Not only percent of the Jewish majority, but the 100%, including the 20% of the Arab minority. And for that, reconciliation is important, but it's not enough. Dialogue is important, but it's not enough. We not only bring people together to speak, we also move into other programs where we bring people together to cooperate, to become partners, where they partner for the future based on their own interests, even though they cannot accept totally their differences about the past. So the way Givat Chaviva deals about reconciliation in memory is two major ways. One, we do not put the memories aside. We work with it. We bring them into the dialogue. It's part of the discussion. We don't have to accept totally the other narrative. We have to accept that the narrative exists and that each people from this country have a right to maintain their narrative. And the second is, we do not leave it only to the memories, because this is where both people become in a victimized mode. We take it to the future, where the two people that are sharing this country in Israel can show how their shared interests become a base for a shared future. That is the only future that will make a promise for a democratic state of Israel, where all citizens are treated equal and where the next generations would live in peace and would live together. So with that, I finish my presentation, and I welcome any kind of questions going ahead. Thank you so much.
תודה רבה לך. Vielen Dank an Yaniv Sagi von Givat Chaviva. Als nächstes darf ich Frau Orit Margaliot begrüßen. Sie ist Deputy Director von Guiding Department in Yad Vashem und wird uns Impulse geben über praktische Gedenkarbeit in dieser Gedenkstätte. Frau Margaliot, ich begrüße Sie.
Memorial Center. Welcome, Ms. Margaliot.
Thank you very much for having me. I will follow also this PowerPoint, and if we can please have the next slide. If we look at Yad Vashem and how Yad Vashem was constructed throughout the years, one of the things that we can see, and you can see in front of you the verse from the book of Isaiah that the name of Yad Vashem is taken from, is this is the mission of Yad Vashem as a whole, from the moment the law of Yad Vashem was legislated in 1953 and ongoing till today and hopefully into the future. And the concept of Yad Vashem, of a memorial and the name, the way of implementation has developed and changed throughout the years. If the years of Yad Vashem were dedicated to search mostly, and also for gathering of information, the next phase took Yad into the place of commemoration. And the third, which I would like to emphasize my presentation, regards the education. And when we do education, maybe important things is what do we center? And if we look at the next slide, we can see the words of Leni Yechiel, the Holocaust historian, the way it was phrased in the 60s, and the fact that the relevant dealing with the topic of the Holocaust and the challenge of the topic of Holocaust centers mankind behavior and actions. Therefore, we have to speak about people and the fact that the Holocaust was an event of people inflicting on other people. And the question is, how can we transfer this into education, into active memorialization? And when we look into this aspect, I would like to open, first of all, with a new project which was actually launched this year. And you can see that in the next slide. And this is a cooperation that is conducted today between between Yad Vashem and the Aspen Gymnasium in Bavaria. And this is a project titled Reading Together. The idea is two classes of 10th grade, one from Germany, one from Israel, in this case, Orte Kiryat Monskin School, go through a shared learning experience that focuses on the story of one teenager, their age, and this is the case of Ruth Meyer. Ruth Meyer, who was born in 1920 in Vienna, in Austria, and wrote a diary for 6 years from the age of 16, from 1936, till she was deported to Auschwitz, where she perished in the end of 1942. And the idea of centering, first of all, such a diary is to present the Jews, first of all, before they were victims. Who were they before they were victimized? Who were they as human beings? And one of the things that is greatly emphasized in this is seeing her daily life and how she defined herself and with which issues she dealt with. For example, the first entry that you can see here from 1936 deals with the whole issue of love as a regular teenager, which brings it closer also to the teenagers today. The same acute questions that they deal with today are definitely the ones that were dealt before. And in that way, do not regard to the Jews living in the interwar period and later on during the Holocaust as plakat images, but one-dimensional images, but actually as round characters, as people with different depths. And so we can see it also regarding the way they define their identity if we look at the next slide. And that is even how do they define their own identity? And the fact we can find Austrian Jews and German Jews, and also we can find them also many times in Poland and other places in the whole sphere, Jews that can also celebrate Christmas, and it's not a contradiction to the way they define their Jewish identity. And the fact that Jews do not necessarily live in the void, in contrast to the stereotypical image that many times we obtain today, and definitely also teenagers. The idea of this project is to take this one step forward. And the one step forward that it is taken to, that from also mutual and using the time of today, as we're speaking of COVID times, so digital platforms, having mutual meetings of shared study, but also what does it mean to us today in the 21st century, and creating a joint website of where do we take the memory today? Where do we want, which shape do we want the memory to form in the 21st century? And this is the emphasis also of the following project I would like to shortly expose to. the question of what is relevant. When we speak about relevancy, how do we define relevancy? And how do we utilize, or we bring also, utilize is a strong word, but bring also youth into this process of understanding that they are the shapers of memory and commemoration of the future. And therefore, how can they take an active part of it, not only by an historical study, but actually being active in creating different forms of commemoration. And you can see this issue of, first of all, relevancy. The poster that is in front of you and the translation is in the title above. How many eyes does a person need to look and see? This is, of course, based from Bob Dylan's song, but it is connected to the whole issue of bystanders. And looking from the big questions that can be derived from the period of the Holocaust, their relevancy is also for today. Not by drawing direct comparisons between those times, which were definitely extreme times, to today, but how do we make it relevant? By asking the big questions that apply today as well, one of them about bystanders, and we can see it also in the following examples. If we look at the next slide, this is the framework that this is conducted. When we speak about educational processes based on artistic expression and creation of forms of commemoration, the first thing that is very important in this process is that it's a long-going project, meaning it's not just 1 or 2 meetings, but we're speaking about a process that takes place for a couple of months, between 2 to 5 months, and the artistic creation or performance is the peak of the process. And the process that the students go through, on one hand, they study the times and the history. On the other hand, they are also advised for the practical, professional artistic expression. And I would just bring a few examples for that to illustrate this idea. So if we look at the next slide, you can see one of the projects that has been running for the last 5 years and also went through different changes. And this is called The Memory Through the Lens. This is a project that is conducted with all educational system here in Israel. Today we are conducting it with more than 15 schools throughout the country. And the idea is also to connect the youth to the community that they live within, to understand that we're not just speaking of the story of the Holocaust as something afar, as elderly people that might come and give testimony, and by that ends the role, but how do you connect to the people, to that, to go back to the first generation who actually experienced those extreme times. One of the changes that went through this project, before I will just say what it dealt with, is that we understood with time, because the Israeli societies today, we cannot just base it on the hardcore Holocaust experiences as the way they are usually perceived, in the meaning of experiences in camps or in hiding places, but because more than 1 million of the inhabitants of the state of Israel came from the former Soviet Union, they have also different narrations, and therefore we are speaking also of experiences of children of war, also children who went through the evacuation into the inner parts of the Soviet Union, and other ways of coping during this period of time. The idea of this project that the students learn how to interview a survivor, they meet with the survivor, and from that story of the survivor, they take what is relevant to them in their understanding as a message into the future. You can see here 2 examples of that project, and they also go through, therefore, how to use their cell phone in a professional way of photographing, and they pose the survivor after the interview in the way they understand their story. And just to share with you the quotes here that you can that are attached to each one of these photos, the one to the left where you see the in a very maybe surprising image of sliding through not amusement park, but in a park. The quote here is, "I miss the childhood that was stolen from me." So again, to what do you connect? What is actually taken as a message? And on the other hand, in the second representation here, the quote that titles, "I am so busy in living that I have no time to die." And this in a way connects also to show the survivors as active people, but also to connect them to the youngsters today. And where do they meet them? What do they want to take from this moment on? The second project, or the third project I would like to bring here, and if we can please have the next slide, is something that has been going on for the last 15 years. And these are musical performances that usually usually take place or on January 27th as the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, or on the Israeli Holocaust Remembrance Day that falls around May, April, depending, of course, where the general date meets the Jewish date. And the idea here are students take writings of survivors, but of Jews and non-Jews from the period of the time, as well as reflections on the Holocaust afterwards, and they compose music and perform with this to the public. The idea is to use these Remembrance Day not in those strict ceremonies, but to show again something that is active, that can be connected, and therefore also the performance are not classic performances of music, but we have here sometimes also heavy rock, metal rock. We have different kinds of styles of music performed. I would like to share with you for a second, hopefully it will come up in the next slide, a few seconds from one of the songs that was performed 3 years back with the musical group of, which is a city group of Jerusalem by the Yellow Submarine. This is actually a war song that is called Siegfried Line, and you will be able to hear it in English and in German. So let's just take a second and hopefully we can hear it all. If it's possible to press play, thank you. Okay, so I understand we can't hear the music. Okay, so I won't waste time on this. If you will be interested, we'll send it, I'll be happy to send it later on. But this concept of performance, you can see also the way the youth perform. It's not in black and white code dress. It's bringing themselves, and they are the depictors and the memory shapers into the future. Another project that I would like to share with you, if you can please then have the next slide. And I don't know if it will work again. We will try our luck, hopefully. And this is based on objects. One of the things that Yad Vashem has collected throughout the years, and definitely also in the last, more than the last decade, with a special project named Gathering the Fragments, of bringing in letters, objects from survivors' homes in order that they won't be lost into the abyss, into the future, and basing on them in short animation films, the stories of those survivors. And by using these very short clips, putting in within, centering the human aspect and moral dilemmas that people faced, and through that to mediate over the gap of 75 years since the Holocaust has ended, still bringing in a relevant way the stories of these survivors. So maybe we'll try it again, hopefully. You jumped one forward, we need one back, and there's a play button. Now, in case we don't have the vocals, I'll still leave it, even though the vocals is important, so at least you'll see the graphics, okay? Okay, we have volume, which is good. the camp, and the importance of how do you maintain your identity in such extreme times. I would like the last minute I have left to dedicate to a acute challenge facing today. And if we go to the next slide, and I will speak over, as I'll be the sound over of this film, we'll see only the first 30 seconds of it, okay? And this is a work made by students, academic students of WITSO Academic Institute in Haifa. And this raises the question of how does the third and fourth generation see themselves in connection to the past? And what you can see here, in a way, is sometimes the place of connecting yourself directly to the grandparent, to the great-grandparent. And this raises the most important question, and I'll wait just 1 second so you can see this transformation, the way it's expressed here. Okay, and if you can please go to the next slide, and that will be my closing. And this raises the great question, and this is from the same project. And the question is, how can we defer, or the challenge, between raising empathy and identification? And you can see in this postcard that was designed by these art students, the way that the Star of David is projected on the young person here. And that we have to be very careful in how we see, how do we create this relevance? And that, yes, we would take this into the future, and that it will be relevant to the young people of today and the young people of tomorrow, but being very careful of manipulation and of identification. And this is definitely the challenge we deal with today, and hopefully with some of the examples I brought here now, I managed to show some of the way of facing it. Thank you very much.
Ich danke Ihnen, Frau Margaliot von Yad Vashem. Unser nächster Referent ist Noam Leibmann. Er ist Guidance Coordinator bei Moreshet. Moreshet ist ein Holocaust-Studien- und Forschungszentrum in Israel, und Noam Leibmann spricht heute über das Infokit, über die Shoah für die arabische LehrerInnen. Wir freuen uns auf Ihren Vortrag. Bevakasha.
Very much looking forward to your presentation now.
Good day. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present some educational ideas on behalf of Moreshet. In 1988, Moreshet published, with the cooperation of Ministry of Education and some other organization, an anthology in Arabic about the Holocaust. As far as I know, it was the first book about the Holocaust in Arabic for Arab school students in Israel. And approximately 20 to 25 years later, Ministry of Education came to us again with a request, let's publish this book again. I won't get into details, but it turned out that there were no educational materials in Arabic about the Holocaust, not for school students at least. It is important to mention that the Arab students are obligated to take a matriculation examination in history, including Jewish history and the Holocaust, but the teachers didn't have any tools or kits to teach it. I remember one conversation with one history teacher. I was sure that there are some educational materials in Arabic, just not enough. And he told me that they, the teachers, have nothing actually. So they have. After all, they're supposed to teach it somehow with something. So the answer was that if some teacher takes things very seriously and very professionally, he or she will go to the library and start to translate by himself some important text, in his opinion, on her opinion. Then they would send it to other teachers, and this is how it developed. Hence, a couple of years ago, we gathered a meeting with a few people from Ministry of Education and some history teachers from the Arab sector, and we asked them, what do you need? Those kits we prepared were the result of that meeting. One of the first questions we asked ourselves concerned the extent to which our existing educational materials, programs, were suitable for this sector, for the Arab sector. And our general answer was that yes. I'll expand this in a moment, but before that, a few words about those kits. The first kit was a timeline combined with 2 optional workshops teacher can use, the dealing with the Nazi ideology. In addition, we created a lexicon of important terms based on the work of Professor Israel Gutman, and the digitized form of the timeline, including a few short films. The second kit was around 35 lessons for teachers to use, with all of what teachers might need: the lessons themselves, pictures, caricatures, short films, text, etc. We divided this kit to 3 chapters: the Nazi regime, the ghettos, and the final solution. And we selected major issues on which we can have discussion. This is important, that deals both with the Jewish victims' perspective and universal aspects. Our main methodology was to introduce dates, terms, and the events via ethical issues and dilemmas. And why is that? In our opinion, because for learning to be meaningful to youth and also for adults, it must make them feel that they are learning something that holds significance for them. Facts, dates, and historical events in themselves have no meaning unless they somehow interact with the inner world, the everyday life, and the subjective experience of the youth themselves. We thought that if the teachers would see that those subjects can be meaningful for their students, not only for the exams, but also for their present, it will encourage the students to think and to take part, and then the teachers would like to use it. Let me go back to what I mentioned before about the existing and the educational programs back then, and to what extent they were suitable for this sector. When we deal with the transfer of Warsaw's Jewry into the ghetto, for example, the family situation it created, and the impact of the place of the youth, then yes, this is a unique, or at least mostly, Jewish story during the war. But the dilemmas we can deal with are not only related to Jews. And when we talk with them, teachers or students, about perpetrators, for example, as presented by Christopher Bauming's book, Ordinary Men, it is not a story that interests Jews alone. Obedience, peer pressure, and the desire to excel within the system are things that youth and adults encounter almost on a daily basis. The exclusion of one sector from political life is a subject that also undoubtedly interests Arab teachers and youth. The same is true for moral dilemmas within the concentration camps or death camps, as well as dilemmas of refugees, family, or friendship. We were, and we still are, very pleased from the reactions of hundreds of teachers who saw those kits. The first comments we usually get is that they really don't have any useful material. This is the first time they have something, they have the possibility to use good materials that respect them as teachers and respect their students. So this is why they want to use it. Other comments refer to the content of those kits, because those kits are actually interesting. They deal with various fields and subjects and give good overview on the era. While working with Arab teachers, and some of it true also for working with Arab students, we must take into consideration a few challenges and difficulties. First, there is a different sense of connections with the victims. It's true that we would like to believe that anyone can feel empathy to the sufferer of others, and I believe it's true and possible. But we can't ignore, especially in Israel, that there is a political context which makes things much more complicated. Therefore, empathy is not something we can take for granted. For example, if I can quote, those victims are not my people, and therefore it's not my story. I would like to emphasize that this is not usually the case, but it happened. By the way, it happens more with the teachers than with the students, which is interesting story, but different subject. Second, we might encounter with different forms of equalization, such as if that's what happened to the Jews, why are they doing the same to Palestinians? Or the ghetto is the same as what happens in Gaza Strip, etc. Our way of addressing such equalization is, first of all, by providing a space where they can be expressed. I could silence such sentiments. I could bombard them with torrents of information, photographs, and events that prove that this is false. But actually, what good would it do? Using the force of authority to prevent thought does not promote understanding. If equalization was raised, it already exists in the mind of the person who raised it. Suppressing it would mean suppressing the ability to conduct an open conversation, suppressing the ability to ask the questions that trouble them, and suppressing the trust I am trying to cultivate between me and them as educators or with the students. I do not attempt to fight existing narratives. Instead of attacking this kind of thought, I seek to position the question center stage and to contend with it by engaging in what happens back then. In the vast majority of instances, the ability to compare and to define the differences, and sometimes also, and this is also important, the similarities, drives from the discussion we have about the events that occurred through those questions that were raised. The ability to provide the space they need to be themselves, including all their thoughts, also allows them to achieve new insights. Between equalize and compare, there is an important and big difference. So yes, a lot of time we would like them and us to compare. Maybe not to equalize, but definitely to compare. Another challenge is the foundation of knowledge. Some of the teachers, although they teach history, lack some of the basic knowledge on the subject. They also have many times very different imagery about various of aspects than the Jewish sector. The last challenge I would like to bring up is the system itself. The teachers want those kids, but they can't buy it from their own money, of course. School should buy it, and they don't, and they usually don't. Ministry of Education should buy it and hand it out to schools. But until today, a couple of years after we finished to prepare those kits, and after the man in charge on history teaching for our sector in the Ministry of Education approved those kits and gave us all the really kind word you can imagine, still the system didn't find a way to invest the money for spreading those programs. To summarize, I would like to present a new project we're working on. I think it's a good example for our educational approach, especially because it's not built as a project specifically for the Arab sector. I know that in Germany there are some similar projects, and at least part of the inspiration was taken from those projects. This is an educational activity. We insist to call it activity and not exhibition, about daily life in Germany between 1933 till 1939. We named it Like Everyone Else, with a question mark at the end. The activity is built on 6 sections. Each one deals with a different aspect of Nazi Germany: the Nazi street, promises of the regime, the Führer, informs and terror, the education of youth, and German resistance. There are a few educational objectives. First, to analyze the ways in which society impacts the inner world of oneself. Second, to take part in measuring the chances and difficulties of being an individual in a mass society, and in this context, to identify the human characteristics of affiliation with the crowd. We would like also to cope with contemporary issues like racism and exclusion in our own society, to speak about leadership, about democracy, and to examine the red lines we would like to draw together as being part of any society. We would like for everyone who comes through our door to learn the Holocaust, to learn about the Holocaust, and to learn about what people, in general, did to one another during the period in question, the significance of this action for our lives today, and our responsibility, and this is, I think, major thing for us, for preventing such occurrences from repeating themselves in the future, not only against Jews, but in general. Incidents of genocide continue to occur, as we all know. If I do not attempt to appropriate suffering to the Jews and persecution to the Germans, I am able to conduct a valuable discourse on the subject with Israeli teachers and youth from all backgrounds. Thank you.
Vielen lieben Dank an alle meine 3 Gäste in Israel. Herr Sagi, meine erste Frage geht an Sie. Wie sieht die Arbeit von Givat Haviva aus? Wie können wir uns so einen Tag bei Givat Haviva vorstellen?
Like, what is a typical day at Givat Haviva?
Givat Haviva has 5 different avenues of work. So a typical day at Givat Haviva, part of it is at Givat Haviva itself. We have a campus of 40-acre land. It's a big campus. And part of it is in many places all over Israel, where teachers coming from Givat Haviva, facilitators coming from Givat Haviva, are meeting groups of students in their schools, are meeting mayors in their authorities, and we work in 5 different sectors. One is education for shared society. Every year, annually, we work with about 6,000 students in 12 different programs. So on a typical day when you come to Givat Haviva, you might meet some of the students gathered in Givat Haviva. They might be on the lawns, on the grass outside, they might be in the major auditorium, and they might be in a classroom. But also, at the same time, you'll go all over Israel, and you'll meet many other students in their own classrooms, learning with other students from other classrooms. A Jewish class from a Jewish school, as you probably are aware, we are a segregated educational system where Jews and Arabs do not learn in the same schools. So we match schools and we match classes, and we bring them to learning together from their own classes using the same kind of virtual lessons that we're using today in this conference. So that's only one channel. The second channel is about partnerships. We are bringing together communities. We bring mayors and their senior staff. We are mapping their interests, and then we show where their interests are the same as the interests of the next neighbor right next to them, who also has interests for his community, whether it's interests regarding to education, whether those are interests regarding to municipal situations or to community situations. And then we partner neighboring communities. So on a typical day, we will go into two neighboring communities and we'll find teams that Givat Chaviva had created that are working together in order to create a shared future. The third avenue will be programs that we do only with Arab students and Arab youngsters and Arab women. Those are programs to create equal opportunities. So some of them are learning the Hebrew language, actually the spoken Hebrew language, through Givat Chaviva. It's a program that runs with 25,000 students all over Israel, that they need to be able to speak fluent Hebrew, which is not the case without our program. Other programs are taking youngsters for academics during their high school so they can become in a fast track into the Israeli high-tech scene. Other programs are with women. So that's the third. And then when you are actually at Givat Chaviva, we have an art center where people learn together the arts. They learn together ceramics, they learn together drawing and photography and many more things that they do together, where the art becomes a language that connects between Jews and Arabs. We have another program that is a center in Givat Chaviva where Jewish people learn how to speak in Arabic, so they can connect to Arab people and they learn about the Arab culture. And the last avenue is becoming also a top-down organization. We have influence on the government, any government. We suggest ways to change regulations in Israel so Israel can become a better shared society. All this is pivotal when we come back to the question of narratives. You just heard from Noam Leibman how the learning of the Holocaust is mandatory for Arab students. Those students themselves are not able to learn about the Nakba, about their own catastrophe. They need to learn the Holocaust. So when you think about them, that's one part. But when you think of the Jewish students, they're not learning at all about the Nakba and about any kind of narrative coming back from the Palestinian society in Israel. So the essence of our work brings together about 50,000 people annually that they hear the story of the other, they connect, and they create a platform for a different future.
Dankeschön. Frau Margaliot, Zeitzeugen spielen ja eine enorme Rolle bei der Erzeugung von Empathie. Das haben Sie auch angesprochen, dieser Punkt. Und ich habe gestern wieder gemerkt, wir haben gestern auch sehr viel drüber gesprochen, dass die letzten Zeitzeugen von uns gehen und wie wir das schaffen, eben ohne sie Empathie zu erzeugen. Das ist mir auch wieder gestern klar geworden, als ich eine Zeitzeugin aus Ruanda vor mir stehen hatte, wie wichtig das ist eben. Wie gehen Sie bei Ihrer Arbeit damit um?
Okay, I think there are two methods of practices. One is about in 2005, a project that we started with was to go with the survivors, with the witnesses themselves, to the actual places of occurrence and to video their stories and to comprise from that a film that is no longer than an hour, between half an hour and an hour, that can still immediate the story in first-hand, even though there isn't a possibility later on to ask the survivor himself the questions, but they can hear the survivor in the actual places, narrating his story, and from that raising the empathy. So this is one way, and one of the things that have happened through that time since 2005 is that many of the survivors that we did tape already, we have videoed and created these films, have passed away. So this was actually the last moment possibility to do so, and we are still carrying this out. This coming Monday, I'm going to also video one of the survivors who was 6 years old at the outbreak of the war. But again, they're also growing old and unfortunately passing away as the way of the world. Another way of raising empathy by still mediating the story, and this is what I try to also show here through these projects, is, and if I'll use the words of a Holocaust survivor and a famous Israeli writer, Aaron Appelfeld, who said, it's time now to turn to creativity once the survivors are passing away, and to utilize the arts in a way to mediate between the personal story and the contemporary times that we live in. Of course, it's a different form of meeting, a different form of experience, but it's still based on the personal story. If we lose the personal story, we have a problem of raising empathy, and I totally agree with that. So it can be done or by films which are prepared, or by you also going back to the authentic writings of the people from the time, like the Diary of Ruth Meyer, and through that also to raise empathy by this meeting actually with those who haven't survived, but left testimony, and to bring their voice as well. And hopefully this way to still have this connection to the person himself, and not just to the numbers or the merely historical facts.
Danke sehr. Herr Leibmann, die Shoah ist ja, sage ich mal, der schreckliche Höhepunkt einer sehr langen Geschichte von Antisemitismus. Wird eigentlich die Geschichte eben von Antisemitismus auch bei der Schulung arabischer LehrerInnen behandelt?
The question is if whether we teach them about the history of anti-Semitism, or does the Minister of Education does it?
Nee, bei Ihnen, beim Toolkit, meine ich, dass da auch behandelt wird.
So, okay. So it's depends, because it depends on how much time do we have with them and what the specific program. But it's always part of the program, if it's not, even if it's not officially, because I think it's also a very interesting thing, because most of the times the teachers themselves brought it up, this history of anti-Semitism, even if we didn't. They know about it, they heard about it, they, I think, also understand the big sensitivity for the Jewish sectors because of this history, and then we can speak about it. So we won't put our time, let's say, in the meeting with them, with taking one full day of history of anti-Semitism, because I think we have more important things to do, but it's always part of general background we must make sure they have.
Dankeschön. Herr Sagi, der Staat Israel ist ja von großer Bedeutung für die Sicherheit der Jüdinnen und Juden weltweit. Gleichzeitig betonen Sie, wie wichtig das ist, eine gemeinsame Zukunft eben mit der arabischen Bevölkerung in Israel aufzubauen. Ist es auch möglich, ohne eine gemeinsame Identität zu schaffen? Und kann man überhaupt eine gemeinsame Identität schaffen?
Yes, I think it is possible. I think the story of Israel is the ability to be at once both a homeland of the Jewish people that will secure Jewish existence and Jewish peoplehood forever, and at the same time be a shared home with common identity for all citizens of the State of Israel. I do not see those two as contradict each other. Actually, I think they are complementing each other. I think that without the ability to create a common identity, a common citizenship of all citizens of the State of Israel, our democracy is very challenged. And most people in Israel would like to live in a democracy. And for us to be in a democracy, which is part of the identity of the country, we need to create equal ground for all citizens. So I think this is not only possible, this is mandatory for our future. but I also see it as a great opportunity to enrich ourselves. I look at myself as a Jew, as a Zionist, and I can totally say that since I've been more exposed to my Arab partners and neighbors and friends, I became a better human being. I enriched myself. I know much better. I received a lot more culture. I became much more aware of what it means to be part of the Middle East. I became a different citizen of the State of Israel. I really wish that this is something that will happen to all Israelis. I think I'm even a better Jew when I'm doing such a thing. I'm more sensitive to the minorities. I'm more sensitive and I can understand better the history of the Jewish people, and therefore I'm much more committed for a shared future. So definitely, I don't see any contradiction. I actually see this as a must for our future.
Noam Leitmann, gestern hat Professor Moshe Zimmermann gesagt, dass die arabische Bevölkerung in Israel ein Problem hat mit der Geschichte der Shoah und mit der Erinnerungskultur. Wie nehmen Sie das wahr bei Ihrer Arbeit?
Okay. I think they have quite a good reason to have some problem with that, because our politicians like to use it to political benefits. Let's say it like this. There are some examples. You can look in YouTube how some of our main politicians speak about it and how they connect between the Jewish history and the Holocaust to contemporary issues without any, let's say, historical basis for this. So I really can understand why they have some problems with all this aspect. But I must say that we were quite surprised to discover that it's not only the problem section, let's say. Lot of them, students and teachers, are very interested in this subject. They want to understand because they understand that if you can learn about the sufferer of the other, so maybe you can communicate with them better. And I think it would be a great thing if all people will understand this input. So yes, of course, some of them have, I don't know, will resist some points, but it's, if I'll try to make some statistical results in my mind. So I think really maybe in 1% or let's say 5% of our meeting with teachers and students from the Arab sector, we saw people that really refuse to speak about it or to deal with it. Most of them ask us to actually do more. For example, I worked with a group of teachers. We had some 2 days workshop, and the main thing they asked when we finished is from their, let's say, directors, that they want us to make a few more days about it. So maybe it's not what we would expect, but I think it happens, and it's important because it makes make us think that what we think is not always what we'll get, in a good way in this context.
Dankeschön. Meine letzte Frage geht an Frau Margaliot. Bei Erinnerungskultur geht es ja auch sehr viel um Selbstreflexion. Und wie gehen Sie mit, zum Beispiel wenn Sie Partnerschaften haben mit anderen Schulen oder Städten, Wie gehen Sie mit Thema Selbstreflexion um? Weil sehr viele hinterfragen sich nicht, ob sie antisemitische Ansichten haben. Und ich glaube, wenn man das nicht direkt anspricht, tun sie das auch nicht. Also viele beschäftigen sich nicht mit sich selbst in dem Punkt. Wie gehen Sie damit um? Wird das behandelt?
So definitely, yes. I think that today in meeting of different groups together, and it doesn't matter if it's done with German-Israeli youth exchange or Polish-Israeli youth meetings and so on, one of the things that is much dealt with in different forms is discussing stereotypes. As people, we always have different stereotypes. And what do they serve? Which stereotypes are we acquainted with, and then to try through personal acquaintance to dismantle them in some way. Self-reflection is a very important component, I think, today in education, also in more or less homogeneous groups. The fact that you not only learn about the history, but how do you see it within. And one of the ways maybe to do it in education that we have developed in order that it won't also feel as imposing on people or putting them in the corner and therefore they are intimidated, is to use different illustrations that automatically raise different reflections, remarks, and from that to create a discussion, that everyone is equal in that discussion and they feel safe. But they can also express their views, and from that to discuss forward if we're speaking about stereotypes, if we're speaking of different forms of expression that can be elaborated into something much more complex rather than one-dimensional.
Vielen Dank. An dieser Stelle würde ich gerne die Fragen unserer ZuschauerInnen für Sie vortragen. Erste Frage von Marc Trampf. Frau Magaliot, worin sehen Sie die Unterschiede zwischen Yad Vashem und dem Denkmal für die ermordeten Juden Europas in Berlin?
I think maybe one of the first differences is also its location, which definitely also inflicts on the audiences which are exposed to it, and the discussion that is opened and therefore what it serves. Otherwise, I think there are also commonalities definitely in different issues of discussion that are raised by both institutions. Definitely, when we speak also about Yad Vashem, the first thing that is emphasized is really the place of the story of the Holocaust, as seeing from that, dealing with the story of the Jewish victims, and from that broadening the stories, and therefore the question of how do we relate with different groups might be different between the two centers in that way. But I think there are also many commonalities in the question of facing issues of commemoration and remembrance in that way, and narration of the story.
Die nächste Frage geht auch an Sie, Frau Magaliot. Was ist eigentlich bei Interviews mit Zeitzeugen wichtig? Wie macht man das richtig? Das sind schließlich keine klassischen Interviews. Das fragt Frederik.
Definitely. When we interview survivors, the first thing is, of course, to be very sensitive and to be very careful in the way of also phrasing questions and to enable legitimization to everything that is said by the survivor. The occurrences or the experiences of the survivor sometimes raise difficult issues. And therefore, it's important to also show empathy and to be able to phrase even difficult questions, but in ways that they won't feel offended. I think that one of the things that also is important, and we find it more and more today with interviewing survivors, that for some, the place of detachment to very specific feelings in specific points is popular, is common, and therefore how to bring them also to share, to be willing to share those difficult experiences and emotions, but again in a way that is not imposed. And it's not just showing empathy, but also to find way of relating. This sounds very much of big words, but I'll give you maybe one example of one of the interviews that was conducted 2 years ago that I was part of, and that is of an experience of a Holocaust survivor from the kinder transport, who had it very difficult to cope with this fact of being deserted in a way by his father, as he gave him to move by the kinder transport to Britain. And when the questions were asked, it had to be very delicate in order for him to eventually be willing to share. But at the end of the interview, he came and said, because of this approach, for the first time, I had to work or to confront issues that for the last more than 70 years I wasn't willing to even open. So I think really we have to be very sensitive and with empathy, and not to impose, and definitely not to judge in this way. And therefore we have to prepare all our questions beforehand in this way in order to check ourselves, that in no way we will offend the survivors. The purpose is to help them narrate their story so it will be remembered, and not a place of accusation or judgment.
Dankeschön. Jane Wagler fragt Herrn Sage, wie genau erreichen Sie die jüdischen und arabischen Jugendlichen, die einer solchen Begegnung und der Auseinandersetzung eher skeptisch gegenüberstehen und nie freiwillig zu Ihnen in das Zentrum kommen würden? Und wenn Sie dann zu dem Programm kommen, gibt es da einen Turning Point, ab wann es Sie persönlich interessiert?
So I'll start with the good news. Young Jews and Arabs are not forced to come into our center. It is not part of a final exam. They would like to be part of this kind of encounter and this kind of dialogue. Because we're so segregated, they are actually very curious of the message of the other. We provide an opportunity that does not exist in Israel. Unfortunately, when you look from the kindergarten until the end of high school, about 90% of the children growing in Israel will not even have one encounter through their educational process. So those who are coming to Givat Chaviva are not skeptical at all. They are anxious to meet, they are curious. Some of them are coming for the good fight because they would like to show the other who is right, and they find a new opportunity to be engaged in a different kind of encounter. But they are all coming not only willingly, but they're coming really, really curious to this kind of encounter. Where we see the change, and therefore the impact, is in the turning point when they don't need to defend their people anymore. And I'll give you that in a small story that I heard from one of the mayors, a Jewish mayor in the past, when he told me about his son in one of the Givat Chaviva encounter. He said that he felt that the Arabs were so strong in attacking the Jewish people about their narratives that he compared himself to a football match. And he said, listen, Daddy, we needed to play defense the whole time because they were on the offense. And that was in the first day. But in the second day of the encounter, he said, we needed to stop playing defense because we were able to stop just each one bringing his own narratives, but to start bringing our point of view for how will we shape a different future in what will be in Israel, let's say 20 years from now. So the point of change, or our theory of change, is that once we are able to contain the differences and to hear about the narratives and to be able to forgive, which is also something very important, then we are creating an opportunity to move onwards and to use the encounters in order to imagine a different future. And we see there in that point how imaginative and curious teenagers can be, and how they can really create a different perspective for their own future.
Dankeschön. Anja Leibing fragt Herrn Leibmann, wie ist Moreshet mit seiner Tätigkeit international vernetzt und bestehen auf diesen Wegen Unterstützungs- und Finanzierungsmöglichkeiten?
Support and funding.
I think that to say international network would be a bit too optimistic, I would say. There are connections, of course, research connections, educational connections with in Germany and Poland, in the United States, but the vast majority of our work, educational work, is not from big founders or something like this. Yeah, this is very short answer, but usually our connections is cooperations. For example, cooperation with educational institutions, and then we just cooperate with to bring ideas together, seminars. Today is during COVID, so it Zoom. This is the best way, but usually not about the money, just more about the content.
Vielen Dank. Frederik fragt, ich merke, dass es nicht reicht, einen Wikipedia-Artikel zu lesen, um diese komplexe Thematik zu durchblicken, den Zusammenhang zwischen der Vergangenheit und der Gegenwart herzustellen. Das braucht viel Zeit, aber passt das in unsere Zeit, in eine Zeit, in der alles schnell gehen muss und Videos immer kürzer sein müssen, dass sie angesehen werden?
To whom?
Sie darauf antworten, wie Sie mit diesen Herausforderungen umgehen, die neuen Generationen.
How you confront these challenges?
Well, time is an issue. We don't. We have no. You know, it's an educational frame, so you never have enough time in the educational frame to do what you would like to do. But I think it's not only about the knowledge and what you can see and how many frames you can check in your life. It just you can go through examples, you can go through certain issues, and then you can broaden it to your values and how you would like to cope with different subjects. And when you speak about one subject, for example, you can speak about some subject in history in the past, what happened back then, but actually you speak about yourself. What is your values? How you relate to other people, to other to certain issues. So it's, I don't know if it's the best answer to this question, but I think we're not trying to compete with all the knowledge people can get from any anywhere because we have no chance to do so. We're trying to give tools, tools for thinking, tools for researching, tools for discussing. This is our way to cope with this challenge.
Frederik hat auch noch eine andere Frage. Wie kann man junge Menschen in Gedenkstätten oder in anderen Kontexten dazu ermutigen, alle Fragen zu stellen? Oft herrscht Stille, wenn Jugendliche das thematisieren sollen. Wie kann man ihnen die Angst nehmen, die falschen Fragen zu stellen?
Hear from them to ask the wrong questions.
Maybe I'll try to answer this. I think the most important thing, and that also a guiding can never be a monologue. It has to be a discussion. And to create some safe zone with the group, that they will feel that every question has its place. The way of answering, of course, differs and changes. And so this is one thing regarding the throughout 8-day seminar, for example. A second thing, and this is something that we have learned in the past years of its necessity, and we have entered it in every educational activity that we conduct, is to have a processing unit at the end of the day or the meeting, to enable if someone didn't feel, as someone felt nervous or in assurance during the day, during the guiding, sitting together and just opening through even one remark of one question, one sentence, one feeling that you take with you from the day or that you would like to share, and from that you create a discussion that they feel that every remark has its place, as long as it doesn't insult, of course, anyone or harms anyone. But in that, but they can feel assured that they can ask. Even if they might seem to think it's an idiotic question, there is no idiotic question. Every question has its place. But giving it a specific time in the day also enables those who are afraid during the course of the day to stand up and share and ask and question.
Vielen lieben Dank an diese tolle Runde für das tolle Gespräch. Ich verabschiede mich von Israel und sage Yom Tov. Liebe ZuschauerInnen, wir machen jetzt eine längere Mittagspause und sehen uns um 14:15 Uhr wieder hier.